Well, everyone, it's my privilege to introduce Professor Clinton Fernandes, and he's a professor of international and political studies at the University of New South Wales. And someone told me today when I mentioned he was coming on, they said, you're going to find that he's very bold, he's challenging, and we're going to really be moved. And they said, I was asked to promise that we wouldn't have a revolution at the end. So anyway, we now would like to welcome Professor Clinton to us and ask him to address us and to be bold and brave, and we'll all listen. And at the end of it, we'll have some discussion, hopefully, lots of questions. So thank you. So Maggie, you can do your deed now. Thank you. Please mute everybody.
Okay, should I start?
Yes.
Just call me Clinton. There's no need for Professor. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. Always say yes to Father Claude, as he well knows. So here we are. I intend to focus in the next 20 minutes on something that is unreported and unreportable, but it is actually central to the tensions in the South China Sea. And if you can get this message out, then you've done something for peace. I can assure you that there are reporters in their own newspapers who are unable to write these stories in their own papers. So here we go. And I'll tell you what that part is in a second. The talk is called Neither Their War Nor Their Peace. And that might be something that goes on the peace movement's banners, but what it really referred to is the emerging global order. There is a new order emerging. Global alignments are shifting because an era ended in 2022. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the response to it weakened key pillars of world order: food security, supply chains, energy security, political alignments, and the system is also sick in a financial sense. This financial sickness is a result of the neoliberal project of the past 40 years, which replaced the system of regimented capitalism established at Bretton Woods in 1944. That system of regimented capitalism, also called the Bretton Woods system, had sought to deliver full employment and income growth, and to make finance the servant of capitalism. But in the late 1970s, with neoliberalism, finance once again became the master, and the barriers separating commercial and investment banking were torn down. There were new, very risky financial products permitted. Banks were allowed to measure their own risk exposures, and the result was uncontrolled cross-border flows of hot money and volatility and risk that are basically unprecedented in human history. These processes led to the global financial crisis of 2008. Now, the response to the GFC worsened the problem. Just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, the United States Federal Reserve has the role of managing the money supply in the US economy. So it is the only institution that can legally increase money supply by simply printing or issuing new currency. It was established in 1913. And between 1913 and 2008, which is the global financial crisis, it increased the US money supply by just under $1 trillion US. So let's take round figures, 100 years, $1 trillion. But from 2008 till earlier this year, to 2023, it increased the money supply to $9 trillion by buying US Treasury bonds. That means the US Federal Reserve has created 900 years of money in 15 years. Okay, it's unprecedented in human history, and it's called ZIRP, Z-I-R-P, which stands for Zero Interest Rate Policy. This ensured ultra low short-term interest rates. Well, now, because of the inflation as a result of the Ukraine crisis and the pandemic and the supply chain shortage, the Federal Reserve has slammed on the brakes, and some businesses only made sense in a 1% or a 0% interest rate world. This year will be a discovery process. We'll be able to identify that some businesses no longer make sense because we haven't lived in the 5% world since 2007. If this, and you can see the banking crisis in the United States with the Silicon Valley Bank and a number of smaller banks are failing and have to be bailed out. And this is because of the era of cheap money is gone, and they have invested their balances in sometimes risky endeavors, and now the interest rates are up, so it's big trouble. But if that is challenging for US businesses, then it is much more challenging for developing countries when interest rates rise. Government debt increased by almost $2 trillion in more than 100 developing countries. And now central banks are raising interest rates, which means increased borrowing costs and more hunger and shortages in the global south. And so few countries in the global south have joined the campaign of economic sanctions against Russia. They sympathize with the plight of the Ukrainian people, but they don't seem to be interested in making costly sacrifices to uphold a so-called rules-based international order. And I think much of the world wants neither war nor an unjust peace. And so neutrality is becoming a serious option. And there is now talk of active non-alignment in Latin America. There's talk of multipolarity and of realignment, including in the Pacific Island countries. Of course, you'll recall that this is the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, but it's also the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine, signed by James Monroe, actually written by John Quincy Adams in 1823. So that's 200 years. And there's a link between the 200-year anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine and the 20th anniversary of the Iraq invasion. Namely, the United States is losing dominance over its traditional empire. Take, for example, the war on terror, Afghanistan, Iraq. There were no war on terror, torture sites, black sites, rendition sites anywhere in Latin America. They were in places like Poland, Romania, Lithuania, and of course, Libya, Syria, and Egypt before the Arab Spring. And so this signals a kind of weakening of American control in its own hemisphere. Now, coming to AUKUS. AUKUS reflects Australia's policy planners' fear that the United States is losing its primacy in the region. The idea behind AUKUS is not new. It's actually 150 years old, and it dates back to the departure of the British garrison in 1870, the British garrison from Australia. Australia has long insisted on maximum influence in the Southwest Pacific. Sometimes this is called the Deakin Doctrine, after Alfred Deakin, who took certain initiatives in the 1870s. And the aim is to keep a Western power committed to the region, a Western imperial power committed to the region. First, Britain, now the United States. And the two goals are complementary. Imperial power from the West provides a benign environment for Australia's regional power here. And our regional power gives us influence to uphold Western imperial primacy elsewhere. These things were on display. These twin goals were on display in the various white papers on foreign and defense policy. 2016 by the Turnbull government, 2017 was a foreign policy white paper, the 2020 defense strategic update by the Morrison government. And these documents were a sign that Australia's policy planners feared that the United States' commitment to our region was weakening. And so they needed to do, our policy planners needed to do whatever it took to strengthen American resolve. And this is the context for the great hand-wringing last year, when the news broke that the Solomon Islands had negotiated an agreement with China involving ship visits, logistical replenishment, and so on. It was very embarrassing and humiliating for Australia's policy planners, because they know the United States respects power and authority. Talk of mateship and shared values is for public consumption. Privately, they know the United States expects Australia to dominate the Southwest Pacific so that it can devote military and intelligence resources to dominating the Northwest Pacific and East Asia. We are, in fact, their southern shield, their southern anchor. Taiwan and Japan are the northern anchor. And so AUKUS is really a demonstration of our commitment to preserving US imperial primacy in our region for the next 4 decades. AUKUS is not something that has been imposed on Australia. Australia's policy planners initiated the request. The goal ultimately is to prevent the emergence of a multipolar world, to prevent something called a democratic, equitable international order. If you've never heard that phrase, a democratic, equitable international order, I should tell you that this concept has been discussed at the United Nations every year since 2011, but has never been reported even once in the Australian media. A democratic and equitable international order would be an alternative to an imperial order, whether led by the United States or by China, which incidentally has shown no desire to impose a distinctly Chinese domestic system on the wider world. China has shown no proposal for an alternative Beijing-dominated set of international institutions. It remains strongly committed to the United Nations and to that the United Nations alphabet soup of agencies. China's Belt and Road Initiative operates alongside long-standing Western-funded development programs. It's not a replacement for them. China is doing wrong things. For example, it's the world's largest subsidizer of both agriculture and fisheries, which are trade-distorting policies and exacerbate hardship in some of the world's poorest countries. In doing this, it's applying economic self-interest, which is no different to what the United States and the European Union do when they subsidize their own agriculture. But this is not an imperial system. And by an imperial system, I mean a system that controls the sovereignty of other countries. You can physically occupy a conquered country, like, for example, France in Indochina, Portugal in Timor, the British Raj in India. But physically occupying a conquered country is not the only way to exercise control over its sovereignty. You can control it by controlling its economics, its choices, even though it might be politically independent, notionally independent. Now, China is interested in economic integration and economic development, and that in a way it makes it quite a lot like many developing countries, because if you think about it, when the developing countries get together, what they discuss primarily is economic development, trade, technology transfer, manufacturing, that sort of thing. When the global north gets together, they talk about war and military strategy. And so when China talks about economic integration and economic development, that does have a resonance in the developing world. For example, its recent brokering of talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It did that without having a single military base in either country. It's got a very small military base in Djibouti, and that's it. It's not the main arms provider of either Saudi Arabia or Iran. And it doesn't provide any security guarantees to any of these countries, which is the usual American model for mediation. And so this idea of simply trying to get people talking, having economic integration, is a big problem if what you really want to do is control other countries' sovereignty. Now, you might wonder, well, isn't AUKUS a defensive response merely to protect Australia's trade routes? Now, that's the argument made by our Defence Minister, Richard Marles, in response to criticism from former Prime Minister Paul Keating. And to say that AUKUS and the submarines we are buying are a defensive response is now an article of faith. It is basically a shibboleth. You will not be unfamiliar with this in this audience. Basically, you've got to say that if you want to be considered to be respectable. But the submarines are about deterring threats to our energy security, because we are vulnerable. We are an island. We have to import things. We are not self-sufficient in energy. We're not self-sufficient in fertilizers. And so the submarines are basically defensive because they're really about deterring threats to our trade routes. The problem is that this is completely false. China is even more vulnerable to strangulation. China imports 75% of its domestic oil consumption. It imports 40% of its gas consumption. It also has to confront the Malacca dilemma. Namely, most of its energy imports have to pass through the Strait of Malacca after making the long transit across the Indian Ocean, which is heavily patrolled by increasingly hostile navies. Any war in the Western Pacific would disrupt nearly all of China's trade, whereas for us and the United States, only our trade with China would be disrupted. And there's a word for these threat scenarios that are used to justify the submarine purchase. This talk about protecting ourselves from China's interference with our trade routes. I think a psychologist would have no difficulty recognizing this as projection. And Nuno will probably explain it to you after I finish talking. If the objective is to join the United States in threatening China's fuel supplies, then such a policy can't be stated quite so brazenly. It must be recast in terms of threat, namely a communist government that's bent on world domination. But in fact, AUKUS provides evidence for a very different conclusion, namely that it is a conscious application of principles of imperial planning that go back to the 1870s. But now here's the thing that is unreported in the press, and it, bless you, and is unreportable. I have tried. There are a couple of journalists who have tried to write this in their own papers. Can't get it in. It's tight editorial control blocking this discussion. Here's the issue. There's something called exclusive economic zones. Exclusive economic zones were established as a feature of international maritime law, and therefore international law, by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea in 1982. Exclusive economic zones refer to waters extending 200 nautical miles from a country's coastline. Okay, so your territorial waters are just 12 nautical miles from your coast. That's your own waters. But the exclusive economic zone go 200 nautical miles from your coastline. They are not your waters, but rather what it is you've got the right to regulate economic activities like fishing and oil exploration within the exclusive economic zone. The United States has not ratified the Law of the Sea Convention, but it says it will act in accordance with it. And so it established its own exclusive economic zone within 200 nautical miles of its coast. And it recognizes the exclusive economic zones of other countries as well. China has signed and ratified the Law of the Sea Convention, and it's done the same thing. Okay, it's established its own EEZ, recognizes the EEZs of other countries. Here's the controversy. This is what's unreportable. The United States says that it has the right to conduct military and intelligence collection activities within any country's exclusive economic zone anywhere in the world, and that it can do so as close as 12 nautical miles from any country's coastline. It says other countries can do the same inside the United States' exclusive economic zone. China says it respects freedom of navigation in the disputed South China Sea, but it does not respect the right of any government to conduct military and intelligence collection activities within its own exclusive economic zone, coming as close as 12 nautical miles from the territorial sea. The right to conduct these activities inside another country's exclusive economic zone has been at the center of incidents between the United States and Chinese ships and aircraft, and between Australia's ships and aircraft since at least 2001, and it's getting hotter and hotter there now. This issue is separate from the question of territorial disputes. Even if every territorial dispute in the South China Sea and the East China Sea were resolved, there would still be an opposition to freedom of navigation. Why does the United States insist that it has the right under international law to conduct military activities and intelligence activities up to 12 nautical miles from any country's coastline? The reason is that if China's position were to gain international acceptance, then the United States would not be able to project air and naval power in other exclusive economic zones like the Persian Gulf. It would be forced to conduct operations from more than 200 miles offshore, which means it would be very hard for it to intimidate countries that have a coastline. It would be very hard for it to deploy its sensors and its missiles and its marines and their equipment in amphibious assaults. What does international law say about this? It's very interesting because the Law of the Sea Convention is actually silent on this question. Article 301 of the Law of the Sea Convention says that states shall refrain from any threat or use of force. And that's just the language of the United Nations Charter. But there is an ambiguity. It doesn't say whether you can or cannot conduct military and intelligence activities in another country's exclusive economic zone. Who agrees with China? It turns out that Indonesia agrees with China. India agrees with China. Indonesia doesn't agree with China about territorial waters and so on, territorial disputes. India doesn't agree with China about the border dispute that it's got in its Himalayan border. But both countries, which are large maritime countries, agree with China. They don't want foreign countries coming in and conducting intelligence activities 12 nautical miles from their coastline, right? And so this exclusive economic zone militarization is largely unexplained by the media. Also unexplained are the views of regional maritime states like India and Indonesia. What do we mean by intelligence activities? Now, you have to visualize this because I can't show you an image. I don't have control of this screen, but I want you to visualize an object, a cylindrical object that is 3 feet long and about 9 inches wide. It weighs less than 4 kilograms. It's an expendable waterborne sensor called a sonobuoy. If you're American, it's pronounced sonobuoy, Sonobuoy. A sonobuoy is a hydrophone, which is a microphone that can operate underwater. So a microphone that can operate underwater, which is mounted on a flotation device, that's the buoy. It carries a radio transmitter that transmits sounds that the microphone can detect underwater. The radio transmitter can send those sounds to an aircraft or a ship. We and the United States drop sonobuoys by the thousands to detect Chinese submarines, and we're doing it really close to their coastline in the exclusive economic zone. The activity begins, since the media is not reporting this, I should just tell you exactly what I mean by this. In South Australia, RAF Base Edinburgh is the home base of Australia's maritime surveillance aircraft, called the P-8A Poseidons. We have 12 Poseidons operated by number 11 Squadron and number 292 Squadron, both of which are part of 92 Wing. The Poseidon is a modified version of Boeing 737. It's used to drop sonar buoys in the South China Sea. Now, the media reports this as freedom of navigation. Okay, and they say China is interfering with Australia's freedom of navigation. The average person, when they think about this, would assume that we're basically innocent, like Dora the Explorer or Matthew Flinders, just sort of navigating around the South China Sea, and China stopping us from just doing harmless navigation. What are we doing? Well, we're dropping sonar buoys. These sonar buoys, 3 feet long, about 9 inches wide, less than 4 kilos, they can be hand launched over the side of a ship, but more often they are airdropped from these Poseidon aircraft. They've got a parachute that can slow and stabilize the descent, and the sonar buoy has a battery that gets it's energized when it contacts salt water. That initiates a float with carbon dioxide gas, so the sonar buoy then floats on the water, and the sensors, that's the microphones, are then released down to specified depths. And what they do is they listen for 8 hours before the battery life is dead, and after 8 hours, and then things scuttles. They are listening for Chinese vessels' acoustic signatures. They detect the acoustic noise from a Chinese submarine's turbines, propellers, machinery, the water flowing over the hull of a vessel once the vessel goes above 10 knots, cavitation, which occurs when a propeller speed creates bubbles in the water, noises by the crew inside the submarine. Each ship or submarine has an acoustic signature that is akin to a sonic fingerprint, which we use for identification purposes. So we collect a library, we compile a library of acoustic signatures of Chinese vessels to enable vessel classification, identification, activities, and capability. And we have to do this all the time because we have to update it every 6 months or so, because the acoustic signatures change when the vessel's load changes, when the vessel ages, wear and tear occurs, modifications. Acoustic signals are also affected by changes in water temperature, variations in depth, salinity, the nature of the seabed. Why are we doing this? We're doing it in order to identify and kill or attack Chinese submarines and Chinese ships at the start of hostilities. So it is portrayed as freedom of navigation. It is actually target acquisition. How many are we getting? Well, in October 2022, the United States Navy placed a $5.1 billion order of sonar buoys, which means 5 million sonar buoys over 5 years. So it's going to buy 1 million sonar buoys per year. And these are going to be dropped in the Lakshadweep Islands, which is in the Indian Ocean, in the Persian Gulf, but mostly in the South China Sea. And this is no secret to the Chinese military. They know about it and they're protesting about it. But it is a secret to the Australian public. It's largely a secret to the Australian Parliament, although those who know enough to keep quiet about it. This secrecy protects the government from democratic accountability. It protects the defense minister from debate as to how the intelligence agencies and the military should be used. But it is not national security in a meaningful sense, by which I mean the security of the Australian public, the security of the environment, that is the strategic environment, and so on. Now, when people object that the nuclear-powered submarines cost too much, $368 billion, I should say it doesn't cost that much, because that's $368 billion over 30 years. So it's only an additional 0.15% of gross domestic product added to the defense budget. If you scare the public long enough and seriously enough, they'll be happy to pay it. To object that the submarines cost too much does not address the animating purpose of AUKUS. The real question is not, are you willing to pay for this? But do you want to prevent a multipolar world? Do you want to acquire targets in order to sink Chinese submarines at the start of hostilities? Do you want to lie to the public and say that you're doing freedom of navigation? Very misleading. Now, until the government puts that question to the Australian public, we can draw one conclusion at least, and that is that the government is not confident that Australians would support an imperial policy. I don't know what Australians would support. I think perhaps a better word may be believe that the average Australian, like the average human being, is not amoral. given the truth about what we're really doing, given the consequences for those on the receiving end of imperial violence, perhaps there would be calls for a less violent world that is more accommodating to the poor and the oppressed. Until the average Australian is told the truth, the question remains unanswered. But the government's secrecy tells me that it fears the people who elect it. Thank you.